Neil Johnson with you. It is the Tuesday edition of 2020 and a conversation I do want to invite you to join into, especially if you have a question around moving forward. You might have your own scenario. You might be brave enough to share that and get some insights from our special guest today as we talk about money and talking about God and money. As you will perhaps know, especially if you've got a mortgage, the Reserve Bank is getting ready to deliver their monthly decision on interest rates this afternoon. There's some thought they may have a pause and leave rates on hold. We're turning our attention today to even things like a deepening global trend and the possibility of another global financial crisis on the horizon. Well, we're back today with our finance commentator, Alex Cook, the founder of Wealth with Purpose. Alex's early career was in stockbroking. Then he founded a successful financial planning practice, now with Wealth with Purpose, helping to equip Christians to honour God with their finances by teaching sound financial skills based on the wisdom of the Bible. So we'll be talking about the latest developments around the world, the implications for our Australian economy and for investors, as well as whether there is a biblical Christian approach to navigating the way forward. We'll open our talkback lines very shortly, just 1-800-316-316 as we get our conversation underway. Alex Cook, a special welcome back to 2020.
Thanks, Neil. Great to be back again with you.
Alex, before we get into the nitty-gritty, obviously another potential interest rate rise on the way today. People get very jittery about that, especially those whose budget has been really under pressure. I imagine that at a time like this, you might just look to God if you are entering some deeper waters. Just any thoughts here for those who might be feeling jittery at the start of our conversation? It might get worse, by the way, but what are your thoughts for that person?
Yeah, look, I think you're absolutely right. This is a time, you and I have been talking over the last 6 months about some of the challenges on the horizon. So I think this is a great time to really learn to lean on God and to draw near to Him. I think it's often when we grow in God is when we're put under the pump, we're under the pressure. That sort of tests our faith. God knows how we're going to behave and how we're going to act, but often we don't know how we're going to act until we find ourselves in these situations. So I think no one wishes challenging times upon our nation, but certainly I think with the pressure people are under, mortgage repayments have gone up 50% over the last 12 months. That's going to affect a lot of people and potentially a lot of listeners. So it's a great time, I think, to really learn to trust God and particularly seek wisdom. The book of James says, if you want wisdom, there's one way to get it, and that's to ask God. So I think many of us, and myself included, when I'm talking to people about money, I need as much wisdom as I can possibly get. So we need to learn to ask God, and He is a good God, and He will provide and give us that wisdom.
Okay, it is naturally unsettling to even use those words, global financial crisis, in a level of speculation that there may well be one on the horizon. We're not the only ones talking about this, though, but give us some insight here, Alex. Some of the events of these past few weeks that cause you to be unsettled and cause you to have this thought that, yes, we might be on that track.
Well, just one initial comment, though. People just have to remember history. Crises are not unusual. We always get through them. Yes, they're not pleasant at the time, but they are part of the business cycle. And of course, many listeners went through the 2008 crisis, where the Australian stock market fell 55%. So these, they're not fun to go through, but they're not unusual. So, we shouldn't be that surprised when they occur. But really, the last couple of weeks has been fascinating, and certainly, if you like, some warning signs of potential crises ahead. So probably the big trigger was a couple of weeks ago when a large bank in America called Silicon Valley Bank, it went broke. It was estimated, I think, to be the 16th largest bank in the US. And at the same week, two other smaller banks went broke. Now, it's important for listeners to probably understand the US banking system is a bit different to ours. There's a lot more banks. You have a couple of huge banks like Citibank and Bank of America, which people have probably heard those names before. But there's 5,000 regional banks. And so it's quite different in that regard. And what's actually happening now and what's happened since is people have become quite nervous about the smaller banks. And so many of the smaller banks are experiencing large withdrawals. I think in 1 week, there was $120 billion withdrawn from some of the small regional banks in the US. So that, is a significant sum of money. And obviously that's when the US regulators step in to provide liquidity to prevent these banks from going under. Of course, if you go across the pond to Europe, they haven't avoided their fair share of problems with, you could call it the near collapse of Credit Suisse. Credit Suisse is an extremely important global bank just because of its sheer size, and it's been on the nose for probably the better part of the last 12 months. They've gone through massive restructures and had quite a few problems, had a lot of losses, and so there appears to be what I'd call a government-engineered merger between Credit Suisse and UBS, creating the largest bank in Switzerland. And so I guess the question now is, and I guess there's a bit of a hunt on, if you like, for who's next. A lot of people in markets are thinking, who's the next big bank to fall? And all eyes are on Deutsche Bank. Deutsche Bank, which is the large German bank, it's also had quite a few problems over the past few years, although it is actually a profitable bank. So people are wondering, is Deutsche Bank going to be next? So there's all these sort of, what ifs going on. But certainly I think the real issue here is what's caused this. And really, it's not a normal situation, because normally you expect it to be from people defaulting. So, businesses that are borrowing from the bank to default, or homeowners defaulting. But that's not actually what's occurred in this particular case. It's actually because interest rates have risen so quickly. Many of these banks hold government bonds as their source of reserves. And all of a sudden, those bonds over the last 12 months have taken quite a big hit as interest rates have risen. And that's put those banks into more difficult positions if they're forced to sell those bonds to meet depositors' withdrawals. So it's an interesting crisis, because it's quite different to what we experienced in 2008. So I think, though, it's got a lot longer to play out. It's early days yet.
Okay, so fear, though, leads to things like a run on banks or a run on bonds, as you're saying. So sentiments, when they hit panic level, that's the sort of thing that triggers what you might call a global financial crisis. Is that the way it worked back in 2008? Is that the sort of thing you'd look out for?
Yeah, look, it's a good question. So really, there's two main things that cause banks to get into trouble. One is you have a liquidity crisis, or you have a solvency crisis. So what's gone on so far is actually one of liquidity. And what that really means is, it means that when us as depositors turn up to the bank can't give us all our money back. And the reason for this is fairly straightforward, and this is a problem for all banks, by the way, not just any bank in trouble. It's all long and they borrow short. What that means is, when they take our deposits, you and I expect that we can rock up to the bank any day of the week and get our money back instantly. But of course, the bank has lent that money out for very long periods. People have home loans for 30 years. And so you can have situations where, if too many people go to withdraw their money at once, the bank simply can't meet those withdrawals. And that's what occurred with the Silicon Valley Bank. To give you a sense of perspective, their bank had $200 billion in deposits, and they had literally redemptions for $42 billion in the space of about 3 days. So that's that much money, because people have just gone on to the internet and thought, oh, wow, I want to get my money out here quickly. And they've gone to transfer their money overnight. And that's basically a run on the bank electronically. And so the key thing with banks is confidence is everything. So that's one situation. The other situation, though, is solvency. And this is usually where the crisis starts. So, as I say, this crisis is upside down. So, a solvency crisis is when banks make bad loans. So, you and I, as a homeowner, if for some reason we default on our home loan, i.e., we have a bad debt, or as a business, and we're seeing this in Australia at the moment, over the last 2 weeks, quite a large, well, in fact, over the last year, but certainly in the last 2 weeks, there's been a number of large construction companies in Australia go broke. Of course, that leads to a bad debt with the bank. And therefore, the bank can then have a solvency crisis. So normally what happens is the solvency crisis occurs first, i.e. bad debts, and then people get nervous about the bank and pull their money out. But what's happening, this is actually happening in reverse. So it's actually, as I say, an unusual crisis so far.
Okay, we're going to take a very short break and a couple of little breakups in the link we've got today. So we'll see if we can get that fixed up. But Alex Cook is with us, and I do want to open our talkback lines. So let's do that. If you have a question, if you have a comment, if you have a scenario you'd like to hear some insight on, because we're talking biblical wisdom around these things too. If you'd like that sort of insights, give us a call now on 1-800-316-316. 1-800-316-316. Alex Cook from Wealth with Purpose is our guest. We're back with more in just a few moments. Good to have you with us on this Tuesday edition of 2020. We're talking about the possibility of another global financial crisis on the horizon. Our talkback line is open on 1-800-316-316. You might have your own thoughts, you might have your own insight, you might even have a critique for our conversation today. You might have some challenges that you are facing financially and looking for a little insight from our finance guest, Alex Cook, the founder of Wealth with Purpose. Our talkback line is open on 1-800-316-316. Alex, some people will be fearful that this could be 2008 all over again. What are your thoughts here? Is it looking like that?
Look, certainly we're going to see more bank failures. I think that's inevitable because what we're seeing in the US is, and the thing is, you don't really know what's going on underneath the bonnet, if you like, of many banks. But what we're starting to see in the US at the moment is their commercial property sector space is under a lot of pressure, and valuations are starting to come down quite significantly, as in like 30% drops in commercial property values. And so that's going to put some of the regional banks, which are the main lenders to these commercial properties, under a lot of pressure. So it's certainly, I think it's inevitable you are going to see more. I'd say to people, though, don't be alarmed because the US system is different, and having banks go under, because there's so many of them, it's a much more common thing. In Australia, if a bank went under, it'd be front page news, for weeks and weeks. Over there, it's not as uncommon as we think. So what sounds dramatic is not as necessarily dramatic. Obviously, it was a major bank like Bank of America or something like that. That's a different story. But those big banks at the moment is where a lot of the deposits are actually flocking to. So many people are pulling money out of regional banks and putting it in the big banks that are seen as too big to fail. So as I say, I wouldn't be overly alarmed at this point. And certainly the big thing that's changed since 2008 is there's been a dramatic increase in regulation. Certainly here in Australia, the US has always been a bit more Wild West compared to Australia, but Australian banks are very well capitalised and very well regulated. So I certainly, that's not to say that they can't get into trouble, as bad debts certainly a long way off here in Australia, from what I can tell. Certainly, the US is much more problematic, as is Europe.
So we might take heart at the thought that we ought not to be quite as concerned about Australia at this point. But if we move closer to a recession later in the year, that has its own implications as well there. So at this point, not a time that you're seeing as a time for major concern, but things can change along with all sorts
Correct.
of global trends.
Yeah, I mean, look, the major difference in Australia between now and 2008 is, on the one hand, the banks are better capitalised, and as I say, they're better regulated. On the flip side, we now have a lot more debt than what we used to. So Australia, and some listeners will have heard me say this before, is that Australia is the second most indebted households on earth. And that's why we're so sensitive to interest rates. And that's why, meetings like today with the Reserve Bank, everyone is holding out, desperately wanting to know, are they, or will they or won't they put up rates? Because we've become so interest rate sensitive. So I think that's the issue for Australians. In fact, the Reserve Bank said that when the cash rate reached 3.6%, which is what we're at now, they estimated that roughly 15% of borrowers would have negative cash flow. In other words, that puts them risk at default. And it means they obviously have to make very tough choices in their budget. You've got to pay your mortgage, you've got to pay your food, your school fees, whatever your expenses are. A lot of people are under a lot of pressure. So I think going into today's meeting, the central bank, and they have a horrible job if you ask me, because on the one hand, they've got to get down inflation, but on the other hand, they've got to be very careful because the average household is under a lot of pressure. So they're in a difficult predicament. And so that's why I think they'll be quite cautious in their approach going forward.
It's all one thing to talk about home owners, people who have a mortgage, but a lot of people who are running a business. And because, times are tight, there's less money around, the cafes, the restaurants, less money being spent on luxury extras, there's an awful lot of extra pressure on business when these things are eventuating too. Any thoughts here as you take this beyond just the homeowner?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, if you look at what the most likely outcome is of what's gone on in the US, the most likely outcome and the flow-on impact to the rest of us here in Australia and indeed throughout America is the infamous credit crunch, is what we call it. And a credit crunch is simply when there's less money to go around for borrowing. The banks become a lot more conservative, and they only lend to top-tier borrowers. And often small and mid-sized businesses find it much harder to borrow. And so that's what we're going to see now as a result of this crisis in the US, banks becoming much more conservative. And so what that means for small business owners in particular is it's going to be harder to get money than what you have previously. So if you need to go and buy a new bit of equipment, or you need to borrow money to expand your business, it's going to be harder to get new funds than it was previously, because banks are now becoming more cautious. If you look at defaults that are going on in the Western world, so in the US, corporate defaults are up about 2.5 times since 12 months ago. And in Australia, during the pandemic, company defaults were actually really low because of all the stimulus money. So it was only about 250 companies per month would go broke. But in February this year already, it's up to 700 a month, which is a bit closer to the normal trend, but the trend is up. So you should start to see more businesses getting into trouble. And of course, this is inevitable as people spend less. When I talk to Aussies, there's this sense of just not having as much as I used to. That's the common feeling. People just feel, everything's expensive, groceries, going out to dinner, everything's expensive. And that's just the feeling that's going on. And of course, that means people spend less, as you say, and that has a flow-on effect to businesses. But, as I always say to people, these things pass. It's part of a business cycle. I think it's going to get worse before it gets better, but these things will pass.
It might be disturbing, though, during the pandemic, as you say, 250 companies going broke per month, and that now is sitting at 700 a month. And there'd be some that were, where the fundamentals of their business were not great anyway, and so eventually the inevitable comes, and some will say there's some bad management that might be involved in there. But how much would you put down, do you think, to the fact of the economic issues that are putting that pressure on businesses?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, look, it's difficult to isolate it to any one thing. Certainly, there are some sectors that are under much more pressure. The big sector that's under huge pressure at the moment in Australia is construction. And construction matters in Australia because it's actually a big portion of employment. And the thing in construction is that many builders, when they're renovating someone's house or building a new house, they operate under what's called a fixed price contract. So in other words, when you sign the contract to have your house built or renovated, you know what you're going to have to pay. But the problem for the builders is the cost of building materials has skyrocketed over the last 12 months. And so many of those contracts are now unprofitable. And hence many of these construction companies are getting themselves into a lot of trouble. So it's a sector that's far bigger hit. Whereas if you think of a business like, say, Coles and Woolies, businesses like that barely get affected. At the end of the day, we've all got to eat, and everyone's still going to go to the grocery store. So it all comes down to the particular sector that you're in. But certainly I think that area of discretionary spending, so discretionary retail, that sector is going to come under a lot more pressure than the typical staple things.
Just 2 or 3 minutes out from news, I do want to touch on a biblical approach that we might have. Just a quick thought or two, and we've talked through a lot of principles that you can glean from the scriptures, over the years now, Alex. But what ought we be giving some attention to if you're looking for a biblical approach on how you navigate the way forward?
Look, I'd say there's probably 3 key things I'd encourage listeners. First thing is Ecclesiastes 11 verse 2 says, invest in 7 ventures, yes, in 8, because you do not know what disaster may come upon the land. So when we think about potential crises, one of the key things is to diversify. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. So that's a really it may sound like an obvious one, and certainly financial planners would all advocate for their clients. The second one is, I love in Proverbs, it says, a sensible man prepares for problems ahead and prepares to meet them. The simpleton never looks and suffers the consequences. So I think that the key message there is, okay, there are some challenges ahead, so we need to plan for it. So sit down, do your budget, think it through, and ask what is going to be the impact if things get more challenging from here. And then lastly, and one that I love to bang on about, of course, is debt. Try and reduce your debt as much as you can. A lot of Australians are paying more interest than they should. So if you've got a home loan, it's a great opportunity to potentially refinance and get a better rate. Because the Bible says, the rich rules over the poor and the borrower becomes the slave of the lender. So my concern for many people is that they become enslaved to the financial system. And that's not what God desires for any of us. He doesn't want us to be enslaved to the world system. He wants us to be liberated so that we can be generous and, do good with what money he's given us. So look, in short, plan ahead, diversify, and get out of debt.
We are talking about the possibility of another global financial crisis on the horizon. Our special guest is Alex Cook, the founder of Wealth with Purpose. Our conversation is continuing after Vision National News. The talkback line is open on 1-800-316-316. You might have your own thoughts, you might have a scenario, you might have a question you'd like to ask Alex Cook, and it could be as to how finance and those issues affect our families, our business, our broader economy. 1-800-316-316. We're back with more after Vision National News. Wonderful to have you with us on this Tuesday edition of 2020. If you're just joining us, you're joining into a conversation where we're talking about what those biblical principles and understanding might be as we approach the possibility of another global financial crisis on the horizon. And if you'd like to join in our conversation, perhaps you have a question, a comment, you might even have a critique. You might be thinking, are we being too alarmist talking about this? Well, 1-800-316-316. Love to hear your insight today too. Well, the Reserve Bank's getting ready to deliver their monthly decision on interest rates this afternoon. Some are thinking they might just pause, leave rates on hold. They might not. Well, we're turning our attention to a deepening global trend and the possibility of another global financial crisis on the horizon. We're back today with finance commentator Alex Cook, the founder of Wealth with Purpose. We're talking about the latest developments around the world, the implications for our Australian economy and for investors, as well as whether there is a biblical Christian approach to navigating the way forward. So 1-800-316-316, love to hear from you today, 1-800-316-316. Hey, Alex, before we move any further, let's come to a little bit of biblical wisdom that might have an immediate, valuable effect on someone who is concerned about what may be developing. This issue around fear, because fear is something that for a lot of people is really dreadful and can have major ramifications. What are your thoughts here if you're applying biblical wisdom to our attitudes to the possibilities of a global financial crisis?
Look, there's probably a lot that could be said, but there's a couple of things that really stand out to me. When times like this come and I feel under pressure and I feel, oh, the future doesn't look great. When you get that sort of sense come upon you, I like to remind myself, well, firstly, God is sovereign. He's totally in control of everything. Nothing catches him by surprise. And he's so powerful that he can take care of me irrespective of what is going on around the world. In fact, I was reading earlier today when I was doing my quiet time, was that, the story where Jesus is in the boat, he's asleep, the disciples are all in an absolute panic because there's this storm raging on around them. They're all worried they're going to die. And then they wake Jesus up and he just speaks to the waves and to the wind and silence it, and it all stops. And that is how powerful God is. These crises that are going on around us, God may look, and he may choose to handle it, I think, in one of two ways. One is he either calms the storm that's going on around us, or he'll calm you during the storm. So the storm may rage on around you, but he'll keep you in a position where you're calm because you have that sense of peace that comes upon you when you have the Holy Spirit guiding you through these tough times. So that's really important to understand, I'd say, is God's character. I love reading, Psalm 91, and there's a range of great quotes in that particular psalm, and many people will know Psalm 91 well. It talks about resting in the shadow of the Almighty. He is our refuge and our fortress. So there's all these great things to remind us of who God is. But I also like to remind people, life is temporary. God does not promise us a comfortable life. That's not a promise. In fact, he says, take up your cross, and there will be tough times, there will be tests, and there will be persecution. That's what we should expect. And so we've got to remember that life is temporary, that we should be concentrating on the eternal hope that we have through Jesus. And so, when these tough times come, we need to learn to deal with our fears as we face it. Now, the Bible talks really of two types of fears. There's one which is the fear of God, which is different to the normal kind of fear we think about. That's actually a healthy kind of fear. That's the reverence and awe of God. And then there's the fear that's unhealthy, which is when we become frightened, we become scared, particularly with the circumstances that are going on around us. So to me, that's the one we need to learn to deal with. And that is, we need to be honest about it. We've got to be open with God and voice our concerns to God. God loves to listen to us and loves to bring peace into these situations. We've got to learn to keep trusting him through this storm, knowing that he will get us through, whether he either calms the storm or whether he just walks you through it and it helps us through. And we've got to learn to focus on what's truly important during these times, because it's easy to let the fears of the world distract you from what is your calling. What is your purpose here? We have such a brief time to make a difference and to advance God's kingdom, and we need to remember that that's what we're here for, and get on with doing what God's called you to do, irrespective of the storms that may be going on around us. So be honest and confront your fears and talk to God about it. He's more than happy to listen and bring us peace.
We're taking calls, 1-800-316-316. Let's hear from Kay in Gilgandra in New South Wales. Hi, Kay. Welcome along.
Hi. I'd like to say amen to everything you're saying. That is just excellent.
Well done, Kay.
My mother brought me up with a lot of amazing verses, and one was trust in the Lord with all your heart. In all your ways acknowledge him and he'll direct your path. Don't trust in our understanding. And she died last year at 102, but she also taught me, taught us all, Jesus fed all those people in the wilderness. God fed all the children in the wilderness, gave them water, gave them quail, gave them manna. And my dad's favourite one was, I was young, David says, I was young and then old, and I've never seen the righteous forsaken, nor their seed beg bread. That was Dad's one. And we were brought up also, you pay your rent first or your house payment, and you do all the rest of the things second. You keep your roof over your head. So then if you have to go to the op shop or the food bank, that's okay. But pay your rent. And also, a good name's better than riches. If we don't look after the rented house and have a good name, we won't get the riches. We won't get the next flat or whatever. So, we need to trust in Jesus, don't we? Trust in him.
Kay, overflowing with some very good wisdom in all of that. It's like homespun wisdom, but it's biblical founded homespun wisdom and something that's carried Kay undoubtedly through her life. Alex, your thoughts for Kay?
I know.
Well, I was just thinking as Kay was speaking, I wish my parents taught me those verses when I was a young man, because they were fabulous. And look, I would say what Kay's just said is beautiful, because there's two things she gave really, which is some awesome spiritual advice. We may not understand what's going on around us, but when we trust in the Lord, He'll make our paths straight and help us through. Then on the practical side, she said really good advice, which is make sure you get your bills in order, and that is making sure you pay your rent, pay your mortgage, and look after the place you're in. I think that's all very good advice. And of course, the only other thing I would add to that is, in these times, don't forget to be generous. I think there's a risk for everybody when tough times come upon us, that we withhold. We start to get nervous and think, I better keep that for myself just in case. No. Yes, you should have reserves, sure, but we should step out in faith and be generous during these times as well. But I loved Kay's advice, and I love her heart.
Kay, love your advice, and I'm glad you called in. Kay from Gilgandra in New South Wales. We're taking calls on 1-800-316-316. Let's take another call. Peter is in Yamba, New South Wales. Hi, Peter. Welcome.
Hi, how are you?
Very well, Peter. What are your thoughts?
My thoughts are, I'd like to know what he thinks about things like tithes and offerings from churches, and also donations to charities in these times of hard times for people. What he thinks about those.
Okay, Alex, tithes and offerings for churches and donations to charities. Where are they on the priority list?
Look, my favourite controversial topic, talking about tithing. To me, these things should always remain at the top of your priority list, in the sense that, we get into, I'll avoid the big theological discussion around tithing, because we could probably do a whole series on that. But I think the big issue is that the Bible says, seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be added unto you. So I think the point is that we need to put God first in our life, and that means God needs to be first with our money. So the two go hand in hand. And so in tough times like this, I still think we should live generously, we should live open-handedly, and we should hold money loosely. So that's the principles, I think, behind it. And obviously in tough times, there may be situations where you go into a situation where you're the one in need. Someone needs to bless you and help you through, and people are getting you through the crisis. And then the flip side, maybe you're the one who's got to step up to the plate, and you've got to help people through the crisis, and you give much more than, the tithing means 10%. It now might be the time for many people to take it up a level and actually live much more generously with a much higher percentage, because this is our opportunity to do good and help others through this season. So to me, giving and generosity does not stop. If anything, it's a great chance to see God turn up and do the supernatural through these challenging times as we step out and live generously, even when it feels more difficult.
Peter in Yamba, did you have something more to add?
Yeah, just on donations to charities and that. I know a lot of them are doing hard ones, and we get phone calls daily, sometimes 2 or 3 at a time, each day there from charities wanting more money and for different purposes and that. And I just wondered what he thought on that, because we're on pensions and it's very hard to pay all your bills and everything and that, and then we do have set charities that we do donate to, but they're always wanting more and more. You know what I mean?
Yeah, Alex, on charities, thoughts here for Peter, because so often if you have a generous spirit, you want to be able to be generous on every occasion. That's in itself something biblical, I guess, to be able to point to. But when your budget is tightening and you've got to prioritise even the way you've been generous, what are your thoughts here for Peter?
Yeah, look, I mean, he's right. It's certainly tough, and many of the charities are doing it tough. A couple of thoughts. First thing is that I believe we should all live within our means. So we want to live generously and open-handedly out of what we've got, but we do need to live within our means. So I don't think people should be going into debt, for example, to give to these organisations. The second thing is to think of these organisations, apart from the obvious, which is to pray for them and pray for God's supernatural provision, is to actually call them up and offer them help in other ways. Because particularly if these charities are near you, maybe you can step in and do voluntary work that will help them take off the need to hire. Maybe you can help them with fundraising and, operate on their phone lines during fundraisers and so forth. So there's things you can do that are not necessarily you handing money over, as much as that would be nice to do as much as we can. There may be other ways that you can help those organisations that you love. But to me, you should be spirit-led, and you should be obedient to where you feel God is leading you on these things.
Peter in Yamba, thank you so much for your call. Our talkback line open, 1-800 316 316. Hey, Alex, tithes, gifts to charities. Interestingly, you've got local charities and you've got global charities. Some are huge and some are not so huge, and they're reliant on every dollar that comes in to be able to forward on, to be able to, meet the purpose that they're established for. The support for local charities or global charities, in a global sense, you might be talking about a developing world where the needs are getting an actual meal in front of a starving child. Here on a local charity, it might be getting a roof over someone's head or protecting people in some special way. What are thoughts here for local or global when things are tighter?
Well, look, what I always say to people with giving, particularly to organisations, whether it's global or local, is that God will often put things on your heart for particular types of organisations. So, many people have a very deep concern for the poor, and when you look at Scripture, there's literally hundreds of verses that talk about meeting the needs of the poor. So that should be something on every Christian's list. Which organisations are actively supporting those in need, whether it's local or offshore? Obviously, offshore, it's much worse because Australia is obviously very blessed, relatively speaking, and so it's not as obvious, although it's getting worse. I mean, there's just been, in the last week, there's a massive rise in homelessness in Australia, 120,000 Australians. So it is becoming much more serious locally. But then other things God may put on your heart as well. For example, many people have a passion for missions and evangelism because they know deeply that we need to get the good news of Jesus out to as many people as possible. So I try not to dictate to people too much to where they should go, but other than to say, what has God put on your heart? What is God asking you to sow into? And the things that really lift your spirit and you think, wow, I really love what this organisation's doing, I want to get behind them, they're the ones I think you should support through it. But as I say, from a biblical standpoint, the one that we can definitely not neglect is helping the poor. There's a massive emphasis throughout Old and New Testament to help those in need. And boy, does our world need it.
Let's take another call. Kane is in Albany in WA. Hi, Kane. Welcome along.
How's it going?
Very good. What are your thoughts?
Very. This is a bit probably off topic, but I'm new to the Word of God and stuff like that. Probably the last 2 months I've been catching up with this guy, and we've been talking about scriptures and all that kind of stuff. I just want to know, I've been in dark places. I've had anxiety for 20 years, pretty bad, and depression and whatnot. Maybe if you guys have some tips for me or something like that might help me along.
Kane, it is a general comment you're looking for here on tips for going through times when, even talking about this, it could be a trigger for some that, causes some anxiety over whether you can pay the rent this week or you've got enough to get some food on the table. The groceries are going up at the supermarket all the time. We've been talking about fear and dealing with those sorts of issues and finding some level of sanctuary in the presence of God. But your thoughts here, Alex, for Cain?
Yeah, look, I was just thinking because Cain, you said you're new to the faith. I would really encourage you during this season to really get to know God. You mentioned, you're reading His Word and you're learning about God and you're learning about the Christian faith, which is awesome. To me, what makes Christianity so unique is the fact that we have a personal God. In other words, a God who wants to know us, who He knows us, but that He wants us to know Him, and He wants us to have a friendship, if you like, or a personal relationship with Him. And that makes it so distinct in the sense that it's so amazing to think that you could get to know the God who loves you, the God that created you, and the God that has plans for your life. So I would say when you're thinking about all these things going on in the world at the moment and anxiety comes upon you, just draw close to God and get to know Him and understand His character and learn what He's really like, because that will carry you through, because He is an amazing God. He's got a great plan for your life. And the best part of it, He's got an amazing eternity plan for you. And that's something that as Christians, even when the world's topsy-turvy and there's all this mess going on around us, and, we're talking banking crises, we're talking all these different things, we know that we're going to spend all of eternity with God in heaven, in the most remarkable place you could ever, that's beyond our imagination. So we've got to focus on that hope. And as I say, as you said you're new to this stuff, I'd say get to know God and really get to know what He's really like and how much He cares for you and what His plan is for you.
Just while we've got Cain on the line, there's a certain sense, and if you're someone who has been dealing with anxiety, you might be holding some fears around these things. Fear and dealing with it, because we talked about how you deal with that fear, and that can have an immediate effect, and that's really powerful. But it's not the same thing, is it? It's not an excuse not to then keep on a maturity trajectory, getting some biblical financial wisdom and having some biblical priorities in place. One thing to say, I can deal with the fear immediately, but I've still got to have some of those wisdom things developing. Any thoughts here, Alex, around the fact that this is not an alternative when you seek God's peace, but those issues around seeking financial wisdom, they're actually a part of it. They're practical.
Absolutely. I think you hit the nail on the head. So there's the spiritual side of it, but then there's the practical side of it. And Cain, one thing I'd encourage you to do is actually go to our website, wealthwithpurpose.com, and you'll actually find a truckload of free resources there that will help you with your finances. From the basic level all the way through to the advanced level. But really all it is trying to convey is here's the wisdom of God's word, which you're already learning, and here's how you apply it. So when we have fears, well, here you've got a spiritual solution, but you've also got the practical solution. You know what things you need to do and what things you need to put into practice in order to improve your finances, but at the same time, draw closer to God.
Cain, thank you so much for your call. Time is running short now. Is it worth just popping a question like what major things might you be on the lookout for? Are there some major global shifts that you've been monitoring, those sorts of things that'll affect our own finances here? Thoughts quickly on that one, Alex?
Yeah, look, The world, I think, in the last 12 months has really changed quite remarkably, where it's really become obvious that we're shifting from a unipolar world with the United States as the number one global power into a much more multipolar world. You've got the rise of China. You've just had the president of China over in Russia doing deals and building partnerships. You've got Russia and Saudi Arabia doing a trade deal. You've got all these things going on. And a shift away from the US dollar. That's happening slowly. But the point is the world is really sort of almost splitting two at the moment. You've got the sort of America and Europe bloc, of which Australia is part of. Then you've got the Russia, China, Iran, Brazil, India, South Africa, all these countries that are getting together as well. And the world is changing quite significantly, and I think it'll look quite different in 10 years' time. The challenge, of course, of this is that's when these changes are going on, you do get more instability. And my probably big concern is this war that's going on. It may be a bit quiet at the moment because, people have been here listening to it for a year, but the war is very concerning. There's massive troop buildup. Central banks are now buying gold, which is usually a bit of a warning sign of potential war. You've got China that's been selling its US government debt, which is, because they're probably worried about sanctions that would happen, that come upon them if they attack Taiwan. So there's all these things going on in the background that show the world is going into this much more challenging place. But so that sounds really negative with all these global shifts. But as I said before, God is still sovereign. And I believe in these challenging times ahead, we have such a wonderful opportunity with the gospel to bring people hope, to bring them the truth that Jesus Christ, and we're going to Easter and thinking about the fact that Jesus died on the cross for our sins, and that debt he paid means that one day we'll be resurrected and we'll be with him in heaven. I mean, yes, tough times are here, but boy, we've got a God that's so above all of these circumstances, and we should be very thankful for that.
And when he is in the circumstances with us, we have his strength to call on, and we have his provision to call on. Great insights as always, and we could have kept on talking for a lot longer, Alex, but time has run out for our segment today. Let me point listeners to how they get a hold of some of those resources that you are talking about, those free resources, and for people who are just getting their head around, or they've never really heard. There's all sorts of biblical wisdom on finances. I better check that out. Well, you can do at wealthwithpurpose.com. That's the website for Alex Cook, wealthwithpurpose.com. You can connect with Alex there too. There's all sorts of free resources, ebooks, the My Toolkit. There's free videos, there's podcast content, anything there that might be useful and helpful for you as you're going through some challenges around finances. You can also follow Alex on Facebook and on Twitter. And Alex Cook, always so good getting your insights. We're going to do these segments a little less frequently than weekly, but we're going to do them longer when we do. So opportunity there for listeners to call in and to have their questions answered. I just appreciate you so much, Alex, and good on you for offering all of this great wisdom, reading between the lines on some of the issues that are happening globally. So appreciate you very much, and thanks for being with us once again today on 2020.
Thanks, Neil. Always a pleasure. Love being with you.